when one wants to start the implementation of a program based on ISO 14000? Thank you.
As an institution of higher learning, you are in one of the best positions. First of all, you have to understand the basics of ISO 14000 and have to be environmentally conscious of what it stipulates. And most of ISO 14000, as you would know, is not exactly a standard, but a management system. As such, if you can understand the specific management of the environmental systems, you will be in a position to implement it. While implementing itself, you have to make sure that you are not following a standard, but the standard should be used to follow what your company needs at that time.
Let's continue now going through the different countries in Latin America. Let's go to Brazil now. The next participation comes from Sao Paulo, from Fundação Sao Carlos Alberto Valsolini. Welcome.
Okay. The question is, how many industries or how many organizations have already received the certificate ISO 14000? And if possible, to know what sector they represent, paper industry, alimentation, and if possible as well to know how many in Latin America or in Brazil have already been contemplated with the ISO 14000.
ISO 14000 actually is a new concept. It just came into being and it is being followed. We do not have any exact agency certifying anybody yet. But quite a number of countries are trying to bring in their own commissions to certify. So we are going to have a little bit of a confusion in the beginning, because ISO 14000 also says a company can self-certify itself. And as you said, most of the companies that will be very interested in following ISO 14000 will be in the paper industry, mining, automobile, and other production areas.
Okay, let's go back to our next participant, Universidad Autónoma de México, Universidad de Cotitlán, Izcalli, Estado de México.
Adelante.
Go ahead, Izcalli.
Buenos días.
Good morning.
Estamos hablando de la FES Cuautitlán.
We are talking from the CES Cuautitlán. Our question is the following.
¿Se puede tener entre el ISO 14000?
What relationship can you draw between ISO 14000 and the global risk culture? Thank you.
Well, when you take the culture of any country, ISO 14000 is such that you can adapt it to that particular culture, because cultures and customs are completely different from country to country. As long as the general principles of ISO 14000 are followed, I think that's exactly what the world needs from you, without interfering with the specific culture or custom of that country.
And now let's go to Argentina. Our next participant calls from Rio Tercero, Instituto Nobel, Argentina. Yes. Good morning. My question is the following. What is the final program, the evaluation of the life cycle, scheduled to come out?
I believe it's already out. The only problem that right now we have is labeling, because quite a lot of countries have different ways of labeling, and we do not have a common sense of labeling yet, because labeling is the final, the environmental labeling is going to be the finality, because it is going to control the marketplace. And other than that, the life cycle of any product, for that matter, is very well stipulated in ISO 14000, where the individual person is responsible for that particular product, even after it had been used in another country, to show that it is not becoming a toxic menace in another person's country.
Actually, Dr. Chalam, I think the life cycle analysis is only, some drafts are available, but we don't have a final system procedure yet for life cycle analysis.
I agree here with Dr. Opper, because most of it was actually taken from the RCRA laws of the United States. And there's still some of it is being still fine-tuned, I would say, but most of it is already there.
Our next participant comes from Baja California Sur, Mexico, from the Universidad Autónoma de Baja California.
Sí, buenos días.
Yes, good morning.
La pregunta es si ya
My question is whether there's already been implemented all the mechanisms so that they standardize all the criteria to implement and comply with the ISO 14000.
Well, the ISO 14000 system is based on worldwide standards. So the standards themselves, the system itself, is already described in the ISO 14001 document. But the standard per se, the number of, the kind of emissions that may be available to any company, the kind of wastewater treatment that must be adopted, this is not incorporated in ISO 14000. Rather, the system incorporates each country's own regulations.
And here what we do have, I can give you a few examples. Like in India, we have got 1,800 major cities, out of which only 8 have got any form of wastewater system management. And if they would like to follow ISO 14000 stringently, they are going to have a lot of difficulty. But as long as they will do it in good faith and follow the general principles, they are going to be all right.
Now let's go to Panama. The question comes from the Universidad Tecnológica de Panama. Yes, good morning. We're interested in finding out in detail what are the 14,000 standards in the industrialized and the developing countries, and why they have not been legalized in these countries, and what are the guidelines so that you can start to implement these standards.
ISO 14000 is a voluntary management standard. In other words, even though it is voluntary, if you do not follow it, most of the countries cannot or will not trade. You cannot buy or sell if you do not follow these standards. So all the countries around the globe, except for 1 or 2, have signed in agreement to follow this standard. But it is going to take some time to implement it, because there's quite a lot of things that they're looking into again and again, especially the life cycle assessment and the environmental performance evaluation, and also the labeling. So it is not going to be a legal standard, but it will have legal implications, because it will even challenge the laws of the local regulations of another country.
Greeting Bella Villa, Medellín, Colombia. Our next question comes from the Federación Nacional de Comerciantes. Go ahead.
Muy buenos días.
Good morning.
Nuestra pregunta es,
Our question is the following. ISO 14000 is a retreat from existing environmental protection standards?
Well, in some senses, it's
cierto sentido,
better to think that ISO 14000 is not an environmental standard at all. In fact, it is a system. It is a procedure for adopting in an organization a sensitivity to environmental issues. But the standards, the regulations, those are really laws and rules that are adopted in each country. Now, ISO 14000 requires that a company or an organization comply with the laws or standards of each country, but ISO 14000 does not itself create those standards.
Viajamos ahora a Perú. Now, our next participant comes from the Universidad Nacional of Ingeniería, Lima. Go ahead. Good morning. How can ISO 14000 promote environmental quality standards? I understand that there's no intervention from the government in the adoption of the ISO 14000. And also, how could you include the implementation of ISO 14000 in the costs of the local consumer products?
Okay, ISO 14000 is a very crucial management standard, and it is being adopted by quite a lot of countries. But if you are going to talk about the consumer products, you are talking about right from where the product comes from up to where the product is being used, and even after that, what happens to the product after it has been used. So there's quite a lot of stipulations in ISO 14000 concerning consumer products. But this also depends on how many types of products that you are making. The more the products, the more the regulations are going to be. The fewer the products that you are marketing around the world, the fewer the regulations will be.
Also, one of the requirements for a company when it adopts the ISO 14000 system is to continually improve its own performance. So the way that ISO 14000 may have an impact on environmental quality is by companies who continually review how they are reacting in the environment and hopefully improve it year to year.
Let's go to Mexico now. Our next participant comes from Tamaulipas, Tampico, Universidad Autónoma de Tamaulipas. Good morning. We would like to ask you the following question. There are countries that would like to invest in countries or nations where they know that the local legislations allow for contamination or pollution with no punishment. What can you suggest in that situation?
That's a very interesting question, because that's why ISO 14000 came into being, to prevent that. So that you cannot go to somebody's country and then produce anything, use the energy, use the product, and then leave the area completely contaminated. Here it requires that the company be responsible for cleanup. And it also requires right from the beginning that the company puts away a certain amount of the profit for final cleanup in case if they're going to leave that place.
Let's welcome now the participants from Venezuela. Our next question comes from the Universidad Central de Venezuela, Caracas. Good morning. We would like to ask the following question. What relationship has been drawn from ISO 14000 and the health sector?
ISO 14000 now takes the occupational health of the employee into consideration. In other words, if the product is not going to be environmentally safe, it is not going to be occupationally safe. As such, the occupational health of the employee and the company itself with reference to the surrounding environment is what ISO 14000 is concerned with. Though we do have some problems because occupational health is the last one to come in. As all of you know, we did have a lot of problems in the United States because the industrial hygienists and occupational health people were left out in ISO 14000. They nearly started a crusade. As such, it has become a very important factor in ISO 14000.
Let's greet now our neighbors from Tijuana. We have a question from the Instituto Politécnico Nacional, CITERI. Good morning. Can companies get certified by themselves, or what entities will certify them? And finally, whether in the southwest of the U.S. is there already an organization that provides certification?
There are quite a few companies, including the British Standard Institute, another two from Holland, and even one from Brazil, I believe lately, is trying to come up with some form of certification. But these are all similar to your own private consulting groups. But ISO 14000 also allows you to become self-certified as long as the general principles are concerned and carried out and documented. And here I have to stress another point. ISO 14000 does not require as much paperwork as ISO 9000. So the standard adapts to your company without your company adapting to the standard.
And let's go back now to Panama, where we get a question from Centro Regional Azuero. Yes, good morning. We're calling from the Universidad Tecnológica of Panama, Centro Regional Azuero. This is our question. Can, in the long or short term, ISO 14000 become a trade barrier at the international level?
I really don't think ISO 14000 will be a trade barrier. In fact, the language of ISO 14000 is very close to the language of the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And the World Trade Organization, the new organization, as basically as its guideline, asks all countries to follow international standards set by neutral bodies. That language could form the ISO 14000 definition. So it is very unlikely that we're going to see any trade barrier litigation or disputes arise out of the use of this system.
To add to that, I will say ISO 14000 was specifically created just to destroy that trade barriers so that you can globally trade freely as long as you follow the general environmental principles.
Our next participation comes from Argentina, from the Instituto Universidad Empresa Blas Pascal Córdoba. Good morning. Taking into consideration the international integration processes, as you could have NAFTA or the European Union, how do you think that ISO 14000 will affect the economies of the different countries that form part of Mercosur or the Southern Common Market?
The question is a very interesting one, because ISO 14000, in all possibilities and probabilities, as I would put it, will only promote trade. What it says is, let's go ahead and let's trade, but let's also make money. But take care of our own environments so that we can trade longer and use less of our resources, increase our efficiency, and produce better products. That's what ISO 14000 is all about.
Now, there is the possibility, as we discuss a little later, that individual trading partnerships that adopt rules different from ISO 14000 may create some possible vulnerability to trade disputes. But if you stick to the ISO 14000 model, it is unlikely that you'll get embroiled in those problems.
Let's go back to Mexico now. Our question comes from Patzingan Michoacan, Instituto Tecnológico Superior. Thank you very much. Good morning to all of you. Our question is the following. What should be the attitude of the different governments towards the companies that do not have the financial or technological resources to implement a system for environmental cleanup caused by the different processes?
Would you like to answer that?
Well, it's hard to say what should the attitude of the country be, but I think, in fact, that there are some issues with ISO 14000 regarding the cost of implementation in an organization. And those issues are different in the developing nations, where the costs may not be so easily absorbed, than they are in the industrialized nations, where companies are already running to adopt ISO 14000. I think the best thing a country can do is create outreach to the companies within its own borders to try and assist it, technological assistance and professional assistance, so that companies can take advantage of these new systems.
And especially in this case, I believe, again, I would like to stress, the institutes or universities can play a major role in the educating of this company management, where they can start off slow but still follow the general principles without much financial commitment. So ISO 14000 is not what we say is put the money out before you do business. It is put the money a little so that you'll have the money to clean up.
You know, there may also be ways to adopt the ISO 14000 system that don't require the significant capital outlay that some of the big multinational companies are encountering when they adopt the ISO process. with some thought and some work within the developing nations, there may be approaches to adopting ISO 14000 that are relatively inexpensive and that don't require extraordinary capital outlays.
Yeah, the thing also boils down to one more thing, that is the number of products. If you can increase the involved, in other words, increase the efficiency and improve the products, at the same time reduce the usage of natural resources with the environment, with taking consideration of the environment, I think that is what ISO 14000 wants you to do, not throw money at it as what many companies in the technologically advanced countries do.
Thank you very much. Let's go to Mexico now, to the Federal District. Our question comes from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, Facultad de Medicina Veterinaria y Zootecnia. Go ahead. Good morning.
La pregunta es la siguiente.
My question is the following.
¿Cómo pagó o se responsabilizó Exxon?
How Exxon paid or took responsibility for the ecological damages caused by the oil spill?
Y si ahora Exxon
And whether Exxon is now complying with ISO 14000?
I would like to honestly say Exxon as a single company took responsibility, but with such a major disaster, just one company alone will not be enough to take care of such a huge disaster. So we, even in California, feel responsible for it because 90% of the oil from Alaska comes to California. So we believe that the government had to also play a major role, even though Exxon took all the responsibilities. But the disaster was so huge. You have to understand that man or the human beings alone cannot clean it up. We need every assistance from the nature. And I predicted that it will take anywhere from 5 to 15 years, and it's just becoming true. So that's the way I look at it. But if you ask me whether other companies also played a role, yes. Other petroleum companies also played a role in helping to avert another such major disaster. Because the Alaska companies, especially in Alaska, which makes up of Exxon, Shell, and quite a lot of other companies, including Chevron, they also went and played a major role in helping to make sure that this disaster does not take place. As you know, when disasters take place, it is impossible sometimes, we feel, just to correct it overnight. It takes years. And I think as mere human beings, we did our best and did make the major corrections so that nature can do the rest of the job for us.
Dr. Chalam, I noticed, I think it was just last week or maybe 10 days ago, they announced the settlement between Exxon and Lloyd's of London, their insurance company. I think it was some $450 million involved in that settlement. So that's part of how that got paid for.
That is in addition to the $800 million Exxon had already spent and agreed to. But I'll put it in very simple terminology. Exxon is a $1.35 trillion company. That means when you have $1,350 in your pocket and you make a major mistake and you're asked to pay $800 million, which is about 80 cents out of your pocket, that's not going to be much. So another 45 cents is not going to make much of a deal either. So the amount looks big, but for that type of a disaster, the amount is very conservative.
Let's go back to Brazil. Our next participant comes from OPP in the wonderful city of Sao Paulo. Brazil, are you there? I think we lost contact. Brazil, are you there?
Is Brazil in contact?
Okay, let's go to Mexico then. Atoyac, go ahead. Atoyac, good morning. My question is, what kind of negotiations are necessary so that ISO 14000 could be adopted by all countries in the world to make it mandatory?
Well, again, it's the part of the fundamental principle of ISO 14000 is that it is not mandatory. It is voluntary, that each company adopts it, each organization adopts it for itself. There's a lot of controversy over the thought that different countries may make ISO 14000 mandatory within its borders, and there's a lot of dispute as to whether this would even be a good idea. It is, in essence, a voluntary system that is adopted by each organization.
It also indicates, you see, even though it is voluntary, when everybody is following voluntarily, the rest of the group tends to follow. It's just like when everybody is driving on the same side of the road, you cannot go and drive on the other side of the road because it's not going to be right. So even though it is voluntary, it is becoming, in a sense, mandated, because countries are saying, if you don't follow the regulation and make sure you are not environmentally conscious, we are not going to buy from you and we are not going to sell it to you. So we will say it is voluntary, but it could be as mandated.
We talk about the invisible hand of Adam Smith. It is the invisible hand that will push companies into adopting this system to take advantage of the market.
Okay, let's go back to our tour of Latin America, going now to Bolivia. Our question comes from the Universidad Privada Boliviana in Cochabamba. Welcome. Yes, thank you very much. We would like to find out whether you could take ISO 14000 as a reference for the implementation of environmental laws in a specific, any given country.
If I may, I don't think ISO 14000 is a good reference for environmental laws because it is a different approach. The ISO system is an approach to management systems, environmental management. How do I watch what my company is doing? How do I monitor it? How do I improve it? But environmental laws take a different approach. They require that companies have no more than a certain amount of pollutants going through their wastewater or being emitted from their smokestacks. Those regulations aren't found in ISO 14000. You need both.
What Mr. Opper was indicating is that we do already have a lot of environmental laws in each country, and ISO 14000, we can say, actually incorporates them. So even though it is voluntary, those laws that exist in these countries will be followed. That's all it means.
Let's go back to Mexico now. Now we're going to Guamuchil, Sinaloa, from the Colegio de Bachilleres. Welcome. Good morning. My question is, what method should be used to create environmental cooperation in the educational systems and society to later on implement ISO 14000?
Any institute has got quite a few departments, and when it comes to manufacturing, most of your engineering departments will play a major role, especially in the increasing the efficiency of production, increasing the performance of the product, and cutting down on resources, and at the same time being environmentally conscious. So any engineering product or a manufactured product has to conform to the general rules of ISO 14000. So if you have a lab in the institute, you have to make sure that whatever is done in the lab is environmentally correct. Those days we used to throw chromic and sulfuric acid down the drain. Now you cannot do that because the existing regulations do not permit that, because that gets into all your wastewater systems and your aquifers. And as you know, these products are very highly carcinogenic. So every department in any university will have to conform basically to ISO 14000 standards.
There's really two aspects to what educational institutions can do. One is, as Dr. Chalam was suggesting, internal, adopting ISO 14000 for its own operations. But the other is external, teaching ISO 14000 to those in the country who might want to adopt it in their own company. And both of those are very significant roles.
Let's greet now the Estado of Hidalgo. The question comes from Universidad Tecnológica de Tula Tepeji. Welcome. Yes, thank you very much. Look, it's very evident that to be competitive internationally, you have to follow ISO 14000. The question is, what will happen to the small and medium companies that, due to economic issues, will not be able to adopt ISO 14000? That's the question.
I don't think that is true, because ISO 14000 specifically takes into consideration the small companies. I remember some time back in Toluca, I was talking about it, about a person who was only making tortillas. And I said, how much of flour are you using? What is the quality of the flour? Where does it come from? Is it safe? Have you increased the efficiency of making it? How is your packaging done? So it takes the whole thing. And will your tortillas stay for such a time, fresh, in a refrigerator? So you are taking right from the source of your flour up to its performance in a refrigerator and the health of the particular product. So however small a company is, ISO 14000 will play a crucial role.
Okay, we're going back to OPP in Brazil again. Go ahead. Good afternoon. We are in Brazil. We are in the afternoon here. We're starting now. Brazil has 4 companies that have been certified, and we know that around the world there are about 100 companies that are being certified by ISO 14001. Our question is whether you know about the program Responsible Care for the chemical industries, and how could it be possible to implement ISO 14000 in conjunction with the Responsible Care program? That's the question.
Well, the Responsible Care program is really one of the most forward-looking programs that's been adopted by any industry. And in fact, the Responsible Care program is much stricter than the ISO 14000 system and requires much more in the way of public disclosure of data and requiring that all of the chemical company facilities throughout the world live up to the highest standard of any of them. So it is compatible with ISO 14000. The companies that have adopted responsible care are halfway towards what they need for ISO 14000. They'll work together very smoothly.
And when you talk about chemical companies, that it is not only the chemicals that they produce, that the chemicals that they produce which they are giving to other manufacturing companies, like tanning industries, they use a lot of chemicals. Wood and pulp industry use a lot of chemicals, like a paper industry on the final sets, use a lot of chemicals, anywhere from paints to the paper itself and the treatment of the paper. As such, the company tells you what the particular chemical is, but the other companies that buy the chemical have to be also responsible that it is used properly and handled properly. The waste products produced are handled again more properly, and that it does not become a menace to the environment. So the CARE program stipulates that, but ISO 14000 in many cases encourages you to adapt to that.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Let's go now to our second module, where Mr. Opper will explain the opportunities and challenges that today's organization face in the area of environmental resources.
Dr. Chalam has left the discussion about the legal implications of ISO 14000 in my hands. But in doing so, he risks dampening the enthusiasm with which he has promoted ISO 14000 to all of you. Dr. Chalam takes this risk because he knows that I, too, believe that on balance, ISO 14000 may prove to be a very potent tool for business to reach that enlightened stage of what we now call sustainable development. But being trained as a lawyer, I've analyzed the draft standards and have concluded that they can only achieve the goal of a cleaner environment if the legal structure is already in place and the corporate politics are meaningful. ISO 14000 is no panacea. It isn't a specific environmental regulatory scheme at all, as there are no performance standards in the ISO documents. Nothing, for example, regulates or limits the allowable amount of polluting materials that a company can discharge. It does not dictate allowable levels of toxic emissions into the air, the water, or land. ISO is not a performance standard. It is a conformance standard. It establishes a system for each company to view its own activities within the context of the environmental laws in which the company operates, and mandates that these companies adopt policies regarding their own environmental activities, or in the words of ISO 14000, their environmental aspects. In this, we find both the promise and the challenge of the ISO 14000 process. The promise lies in the establishment of a global language for environmental management systems, and the hope that the policies companies or organizations adopt will be forward-looking and protective of the environment. Its challenge is that the goals each company or organization adopts will still be very, very different from country to country, based on its own business strategies and interests, and on the kind of environmental standards and regulations each individual sovereign nation sets for them to comply with the local law. Let's take a few minutes and review some of the background leading up to ISO 14000, and then look again at these promises and challenges. ISO 14000 grew out of similar environmental management system regimes that were developed first in Britain and then in Europe. The GATT, as you may know, is the general agreement between many of the world's nations for the conduct of international trade. In February of 1992, the GATT Secretariat, which can't speak for the GATT's membership, released a trade and environment analysis put forth by consideration for UNCED, UNCED, the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, also called the Earth Summit. The report offered several suggestions for making environmental policy more consistent with GATT. It points out that it is no longer possible for a country to create an appropriate environmental policy entirely on its own. It called for multilateral rules for countries to formulate their own environmental policies and to respond to complaints about the impact of their own policies on international competitiveness. This report predated the Rio Earth Summit by several months, but it illustrates that several different forces were all beginning to consider how to regulate trade